Subscribe to Storylab for more stories. Now, let's begin this one. Chapter 1. The Foundation Cracks. Jerome Long had always believed that loyalty was earned through blood, sweat, and sacrifice. At 34, he'd spent the last 16 years proving that belief in the most hostile environments on Earth. The scars that crisscrossed his chest and arms weren't decorations. They were testimonies to his commitment to brothers in arms who trusted him with their lives. The irony wasn't lost on him that the deepest wound he'd ever received had come from someone who'd never fired a shot in anger. 3 years ago, when he'd returned from his deployment in Afghanistan, Cheryl Long had already packed her bags. Standing in their kitchen in Fort Bragg, she delivered the news with the clinical precision of a surgeon removing diseased tissue. "I can't do this anymore, Jerome. The deployments, the waiting, wondering if you're coming home in a box or on your feet." Her voice had been steady, rehearsed. "Chris needs stability. I need stability." What she hadn't said, but what Jerome had discovered through a private investigator 2 weeks later, was that she'd been finding that stability in the arms of Owen Shelton, a local contractor who specialized in military housing developments. A man who'd grown fat on government contracts while Jerome had been dodging IEDs and returning fire in mountains that God had forgotten. The divorce had been swift and brutal. Cheryl's lawyer, a shark in an expensive suit, had painted Jerome as an absent father and an emotionally unstable veteran. The judge, a civilian who'd never heard a shot fired in anger, had awarded primary custody to Cheryl. Jerome got every other weekend and alternating holidays, a consolation prize for 15 years of service to his country. But it was his son Chris who had kept Jerome anchored. At 14, the boy was everything Jerome had hoped he'd become: intelligent, strong-willed, and fiercely loyal. Chris had adapted to the custody arrangement with the resilience of a soldier's son, never complaining about the back and forth, never making Jerome feel like he was disrupting his life during their weekends together. Those weekends had become Jerome's lifeline. They'd spend hours at the shooting range, where Chris showed a natural aptitude that reminded Jerome of his own youth. They'd work on Jerome's motorcycle, a 1969 Harley that Jerome had inherited from his father. Most importantly, they'd talk about school, about girls, about the future Chris was planning. "I want to serve like you did, Dad," Chris had said just 6 months ago, his hand steady as he field-stripped an M for that Jerome had brought home from his latest deployment. "Maybe special forces like you." Jerome had felt a swell of pride that day, followed immediately by a stab of protective fear. He'd seen too much, lost too many good men, to wish that life on his son without reservation. But he'd also recognized something in Chris's eyes that reminded him of his own father, Sergeant Major Lawrence Long, who'd served 3 tours in Vietnam and had instilled in Jerome the values that had carried him through his own military career. "Service is an honor, son," Jerome had replied, "but make sure you're serving for the right reasons. And make sure you choose the right people to serve with." Loyalty flows both ways. Now, crouched in a forward observation post in Syria, watching enemy movement through night vision scopes, Jerome wondered if he'd taught his son enough about recognizing betrayal before it was too late. The mission had been routine surveillance, track suspected weapons shipments, report back to command, maintain radio silence unless compromised. Jerome's team of 4 operators had been in position for 6 days, living on MREs and rainwater, watching a compound that intelligence suggested was a major hub for arms trafficking. It was the kind of assignment that Jerome excelled at. Patient, methodical, unforgiving in its attention to detail. His team trusted him implicitly. Sergeant Felipe Newman, a demolitions expert from El Paso, Corporal Aaron McCabe, their communications specialist, and Staff Sergeant Lloyd Silva, their medic and Jerome's closest friend since their days in Ranger School. They'd served together through 4 deployments, had pulled each other out of more firefights than Jerome cared to count. When Lloyd had taken shrapnel in his leg during a raid in Kandahar, Jerome had carried him 3 miles to the extraction point. When Felipe's wife had died in a car accident, Jerome had used his own leave to fly home and stand beside him at the funeral. When Aaron's daughter had been born with a heart defect, Jerome had organized a fundraiser that covered the surgery costs. This was what loyalty looked like. This was what brotherhood meant, which made what was about to happen all the more devastating. Chapter 2. The Call That Changed Everything. The satellite phone's shrill ring cut through the Syrian night like a blade. Jerome's blood froze. Their communications protocol was strict. No incoming calls except in case of extreme emergency or mission abort. Lloyd looked up from his scope, concern etched across his weathered face. That's not supposed to happen. Jerome grabbed the encrypted device, checking the caller ID. His mother's emergency contact code. His throat constricted as he answered. "This is Long. Jerome, baby." His mother's voice was breaking, barely holding together. Maddie Long was the strongest woman he'd ever known. Had raised him alone after his father's death in Desert Storm. Had worked double shifts at the hospital to put him through school. To hear her like this, "Mom, what's wrong?" "Your ex-wife's boyfriend." She paused, and Jerome could hear her struggling to breathe. "You just put your son in the ICU." The world stopped. The distant sound of gunfire, the whisper of wind across the desert, the quiet movements of his team. Everything ceased to exist except his mother's voice and the ice-cold rage that was spreading through his chest like poison. "The doctors don't think he'll make it." She was crying now, her words coming in ragged gasps. "Jerome, he's barely breathing. Owen, he beat him so bad. And when the police tried to arrest him, he said," her voice broke completely. "He said he'll finish it tonight." Jerome's vision narrowed to a tunnel. 15 years of combat experience, countless life-or-death situations, and he'd never felt anything like the fury that was building inside him now. It wasn't the hot anger of battle. It was something colder, more focused. Something that would burn for a very long time. Where is he now? Owen? They couldn't hold him. His lawyer got him out on bail within hours. "Jerome, I'm scared. Chris is in surgery, and that monster is walking free, and he threatened." "Mom." Jerome's voice was steady, but Lloyd caught his eye and saw something there that made him reach for his rifle. "I'm coming home. The doctor said if you want to say goodbye." She couldn't finish the sentence. Jerome closed his eyes, and in that moment, he made a decision that would define the rest of his life. Chris wouldn't die, not on his watch. And Owen Shelton would learn that there were some lines you didn't cross, some people you didn't threaten, and some fathers you didn't want to make an enemy of. He's not going to die, Mom. And Owen Shelton is never going to hurt anyone again. As he ended the call, Commander Eric Franco appeared at his shoulder. The older man had the kind of weathered face that came from 30 years of making impossible decisions in impossible places. Jerome had served under him for 5 years, had never seen him back down from a fight or abandon a man under his command. "Pack your gear," Franco said quietly. "Chopper's ready." Jerome looked at his commander, understanding passing between them without words. Franco had been listening. Franco knew what this meant. "Sir, the mission will continue without you. Lloyd can handle Overwatch until your replacement arrives." Franco's expression was grim but determined. "A man's son is dying, Sergeant Major. That takes priority over everything else." As Jerome gathered his equipment, his hands moving with the mechanical precision that came from years of training, his mind was already working through logistics. Flight time to North Carolina. Hospital locations. Owen Shelton's address, his hangouts, his patterns. Felipe appeared beside him, pressing something into Jerome's hand. A small plastic bag containing items that definitely weren't standard military issue. "For whatever you need, hermano," Felipe said quietly. No questions asked. Aaron stepped up next, handing Jerome a secure phone. Encrypted, untraceable, the kind that doesn't exist. Lloyd was the last to approach. In his hand was a dog-eared photograph that Jerome recognized. Chris at 10 years old, gap-toothed and grinning, holding up the fish he caught during their camping trip to the Outer Banks. "Bring him home, Jerome, and make sure the bastard who hurt him never gets the chance to hurt anyone else's kid." As the helicopter's rotors spun up in the distance, Jerome felt something shift inside him. He wasn't flying home to talk. He wasn't flying home to work within a system that had already failed his son. He was flying home to end this. Owen Shelton had made the mistake of threatening Jerome Long's child. Some mistakes didn't get second chances. Chapter 3. Homecoming and Harsh Realities. The flight from Syria to North Carolina took 18 hours with connections and refueling stops. Jerome spent every minute of it planning. By the time the civilian airliner touched down at Charlotte Douglas International Airport, he had detailed intelligence on Owen Shelton that would have impressed his commanding officers. Owen Richard Shelton, age 38, divorced twice, no children of his own. Owner of Shelton Construction, a company that had built its reputation on low-bid government contracts and cutting corners wherever possible. 3 previous assault charges, all dismissed due to insufficient evidence or witnesses changing their testimony. A man who understood how to intimidate people into silence. But Jerome Long wasn't people, and he'd never been intimidated by anything that walked on 2 legs. The drive from Charlotte to Fayetteville gave Jerome time to make calls. His first was to Lewis Thornton, a former Delta operator who'd left the service 5 years earlier and now ran a private security firm that specialized in executive protection and problem resolution. Lewis had contacts everywhere: law enforcement, private investigators, and people who operated in the spaces between legal and necessary. Jerome, brother, heard you were deployed. What brings you stateside? I need everything you can find on Owen Shelton. Fayetteville area. I need it fast, and I need it comprehensive. Lewis's tone shifted immediately. How comprehensive? Where he eats, where he sleeps, who he talks to, where he gets his hair cut, financial records, phone records, surveillance footage from every business he's been to in the last 6 months. I want to know what brand of toothpaste he uses. This sounds personal. You put my son in the ICU. A pause. I'll have everything within 12 hours. What else do you need? Equipment. Nothing traceable. The kind of gear that ghosts use. Consider it done. Jerome, be careful, brother. I know what you're capable of, but this isn't Afghanistan. Different rules. Jerome's laugh was colder than December in the Hindu Kush. Owen Shelton just made the biggest mistake of his miserable life. There are no rules anymore. His second call was to Dr. Miriam Paul, the head of trauma surgery at Cape Fear Valley Medical Center. Jerome had saved her son's life during a hostage situation at the embassy in Baghdad 3 years earlier. She owed him, and she'd never forgotten it. Jerome, I was hoping you'd call. I'm looking at Chris's chart right now. How bad? Bad. 3 broken ribs, internal bleeding that we're trying to control, severe concussion. But he's strong, Jerome. He's fighting. Can I see him? ICU visiting hours are restricted, but for you? Absolutely. Jerome, there's something else. The injuries, they're consistent with prolonged, systematic beating. This wasn't a moment of anger. This was deliberate. Jerome's grip on the steering wheel tightened until his knuckles went white. Has Cheryl been there? But she left about an hour ago. Said she had to handle some things. What kind of things? I don't know, but Jerome, she seemed scared. Really scared. By the time Jerome reached the hospital, visiting hours were over and the ICU was locked down for the night. But Dr. Paul was waiting for him at a side entrance, her expression grave. He's sedated right now, she said as she led him through corridors that smelled of disinfectant and despair. The machines are helping him breathe. Jerome, I need you to be prepared for what you're going to see. Nothing could have prepared him. Chris lay surrounded by machines that beeped and hummed and kept him alive. His face was so swollen that Jerome barely recognized him. Both eyes were blackened and swollen shut. His left arm was in a cast, and Jerome could see the outline of bandages beneath the hospital gown. Jerome stood beside the bed for a long time, watching his son's chest rise and fall with mechanical precision. This boy who'd laughed at Jerome's terrible jokes, who'd learned to shoot with Jerome's steady hand guiding his own, who'd talked about serving his country with the same pride that had driven Jerome through his own career. I'm here, son, Jerome whispered, taking Chris's uninjured hand in his own. And I'm going to fix this. Dr. Paul placed a gentle hand on Jerome's shoulder. Jerome, the police have been here. They took photos, collected evidence. But what? Owen Shelton's lawyer showed up this afternoon. Made it clear that his client was acting in self-defense. Claims Chris attacked him first. Jerome turned to look at her, and Dr. Paul took an involuntary step backward. She'd served in combat zones herself, had seen violence and death, but the expression on Jerome Long's face was something altogether different. Self-defense, Jerome repeated quietly. Jerome, you need to be smart about this. The system. The system failed my son. The system let a predator walk free after beating a 14-year-old boy nearly to death. Jerome looked back at Chris, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. The system doesn't get another chance. As he left the hospital that night, Jerome made one final call. Mom, it's me. Jerome, how is he? He's going to be fine. But I need you to do something for me. I need you to pack a bag and go stay with Aunt Deanna for a few weeks. Just until this is over. Jerome, what are you planning? I'm planning to be the father that Chris deserves. The one who doesn't let monsters hurt his family and walk away. Maddie Long had been a military wife and a military mother. She understood the tone in her son's voice, understood what it meant when a soldier like Jerome Long made that kind of decision. Be careful, baby, and make sure that bastard knows exactly who he messed with. He will, Mom. Before this is over, Owen Shelton is going to wish he'd never heard the name Chris Long. Chapter 4. Gathering Intelligence. Jerome spent the next 3 days moving like a ghost through Fayetteville, conducting reconnaissance with the patience and precision that had kept him alive through 4 combat deployments. Lewis Thornton's intelligence package had been thorough: bank records, employment history, real estate holdings, and a detailed analysis of Owen Shelton's daily patterns. What emerged was a picture of a man who'd built his life on intimidation and the careful cultivation of fear. Owen's ex-wives had both filed restraining orders that were later withdrawn under mysterious circumstances. His construction company had a reputation for aggressive negotiations and subcontractors who'd learned not to push back when payments were late or contracts were modified. But it was the surveillance footage from a bar called Murphy's Tavern that told Jerome everything he needed to know about what kind of man had hurt his son. The timestamp showed Owen Shelton 3 nights before the attack on Chris, drunk and belligerent, shoving a waitress who'd asked him to lower his voice. The woman, Katie Atkinson, according to Lewis's research, had fallen backward into a table, bruising her ribs. The bar's security footage showed Owen laughing as other patrons helped her up. Jerome studied the footage for hours, memorizing Owen's movements, his mannerisms, the way he carried himself. This was a man who enjoyed causing pain, who fed on the fear he saw in other people's eyes. On the second day of surveillance, Jerome followed Owen to Chris's school, Myers Park High School. Owen sat in his truck outside the building for 40 minutes, watching students come and go. Jerome photographed him from 3 different angles, documenting what was clearly stalking behavior. The pattern became clear. Owen was escalating. The beating he'd given Chris wasn't the end of something. It was the beginning. On the 3rd day, Jerome's patience was rewarded. Owen met with 3 men at a construction site outside of town, men that Lewis's research identified as Eddie Joyce, Gary Grace, and Salvador Field. All 3 had extensive criminal records: assault, intimidation, extortion. Owen was building a crew. Jerome positioned himself on a hill overlooking the site, using a sniper scope to read their lips and document their conversation. What he saw made his blood run cold. Owen was showing them photographs, pictures of Chris, pictures of Jerome's mother, pictures of Dr. Paul. He was planning something that would send a message to anyone who might consider testifying against him or pressing charges. That night, Jerome made a call to Lewis Thornton. I need to move this to the next phase, Jerome said. What are you thinking? I'm thinking Owen Shelton needs to understand what it feels like to be hunted. Jerome, if you're caught, I won't be caught. But even if I am, it won't matter. My son is lying in an ICU bed because this animal thought he could terrorize my family without consequences. Those days are over. Lewis was quiet for a long moment. What do you need? Remember that warehouse job we worked in Mosul? The one where we had to convince the bomb maker to give up his supplier. I remember. I need that kind of convincing power, and I need it untraceable. Jerome. Lewis, this man is planning to hurt more people. He's got a crew, he's got targets, and he's got nothing to lose because he thinks the system will protect him like it always has. I'm going to show him what happens when the system stops working. The next morning, Jerome visited Chris again. His son was awake this time, though barely conscious and heavily medicated. When Chris saw his father, he tried to speak, but only managed a whispered word. Dad? I'm here, son. You're safe now. Chris's eyes, still swollen but open enough to see, found Jerome's face. He said he'd kill me if I told anyone what really happened. Jerome leaned closer. What really happened, Chris? I saw him with Mom. But it wasn't. She was crying, Dad. She was trying to get away from him, and he was hurting her. I tried to stop him. The pieces fell into place with sickening clarity. Cheryl hadn't left Jerome for Owen Shelton. She'd become his victim. And when Chris had tried to protect his mother, Owen had beaten him nearly to death. Where's your mother now, son? Don't know. Haven't seen her since it happened. Jerome kissed his son's forehead gently. You did the right thing, Chris. A man protects the people he loves. That's what heroes do. Am I going to be okay, Dad? You're going to be more than okay. And the man who hurt you is never going to hurt anyone again. As Jerome left the hospital, he found Dr. Paul waiting in the parking lot, her expression troubled. Jerome, I've been Chris's doctor for 3 days now, and something doesn't add up. What do you mean? The police report says Chris was injured when he attacked Owen in a domestic dispute. But the injury pattern, Jerome, these wounds are defensive. Chris was trying to protect himself from someone much larger and stronger. And there's something else. She handed him a manila envelope. I probably shouldn't be giving you this, but I took photos of Chris's injuries before the police arrived. Look at his knuckles. Jerome opened the envelope and studied the photographs. Chris's knuckles were unmarked. No bruising, no cuts, no signs that he'd thrown a single punch. He never fought back, Dr. Paul said quietly. He just tried to protect himself while someone beat him senseless. Jerome handed the envelope back to her. Doctor, I need you to keep Chris safe while he's here. Can you do that? Of course, but Jerome, what are you planning? Jerome looked back at the hospital where his son lay broken and traumatized, then turned his eyes toward the town where Owen Shelton was planning his next move. I'm planning to remind everyone why you don't threaten a soldier's family. Chapter 5, The Hunt Begins. Owen Shelton's first indication that his world was about to collapse came at 3:17 a.m. on a Thursday morning, when every light in his house suddenly went out. Jerome had spent 6 hours studying the electrical grid that fed Owen's neighborhood, identifying the transformer that served his block and the junction box that controlled power to his specific address. Military-grade electrical equipment had a way of making civilian infrastructure very cooperative. From his position on the roof of a house 2 blocks away, Jerome watched through night vision scopes as Owen stumbled through his darkened home with a flashlight, checking fuse boxes and cursing at his phone's dead battery. What Owen didn't know was that Jerome had also disabled the cell tower that served his area with a precisely placed electromagnetic pulse device, a gift from Felipe's private collection. For 30 minutes, Owen was completely isolated. That's when Jerome made his first move. The sound system in Owen's living room crackled to life, powered by a backup battery that Jerome had installed earlier that week. Owen's voice filled the room, a recording that Jerome had made from the surveillance footage at Murphy's Tavern, digitally enhanced and edited. I like it when they fight back, Owen's recorded voice said into the darkness. Makes it more fun when they stop. Owen spun around, searching for the source of the sound, his flashlight beam dancing wildly across the walls. I'm going to finish what I started with that kid, the recording continued, and then I'm going to deal with his old man. Who's there? Owen shouted into the darkness. I've got a gun. The recording stopped, replaced by a new voice, Jerome's voice, calm and measured. Owen Shelton, you put my son in the hospital. You threatened my family. Now you're going to learn what consequences look like. Owen stumbled toward his gun cabinet, but Jerome had anticipated this. The locks had been quietly modified 3 days earlier. They would appear to work normally, but would jam under pressure. You want to play games? Owen screamed into the darkness. I know people. I've got connections. You can't touch me. Jerome's voice came through the speakers again. Your connections can't help you now, Owen. You're my world now. And in my world, predators don't get to hurt children. The power came back on as suddenly as it had gone out, but Owen's relief was short-lived. Taped to his television screen was a photograph. A perfectly clear image of Owen outside Chris's school, taken during his stalking reconnaissance. Below the photograph was a handwritten note. I see you. By the time Owen worked up the courage to call the police, Jerome was already miles away, monitoring police radio frequencies from his temporary base of operations, a storage unit that Lewis Thornton had acquired through a shell company. The police found no signs of forced entry, no evidence of illegal surveillance equipment, no trace of whoever had been in Owen's house. The electromagnetic pulse device had been recovered and destroyed. The lock modifications were too subtle to detect without specialized equipment, and the sound system showed no signs of tampering. But Owen understood the message perfectly. The next day, Jerome escalated. Owen arrived at his construction office to find that every computer in the building had been wiped clean. Not damaged, wiped. Thousands of files, contracts, financial records, all gone. Replaced with a single document on every screen. A medical report detailing Chris's injuries, complete with photographs that showed exactly what Owen's self-defense had looked like. The IT specialist that Owen hired to investigate told him that the data destruction had been accomplished by someone with military-grade cyber warfare training. Whoever did this, the specialist said, they didn't just delete your files. They wrote over them with random data 17 times. There's no recovering anything. But the real message was in Owen's office safe. Despite being locked with a combination that only Owen knew, it was standing open. Inside, where Owen kept his important contracts and emergency cash, was a single item, Chris's school ID card, the one that had been in his wallet when Owen attacked him. Owen stared at the card for a long time, his hands shaking. Someone had been in his house, in his office, in his most secure spaces. Someone was watching him, following him, anticipating his every move. That afternoon, Owen called Eddie Joyce, Gary Grace, and Salvador Field, the crew he'd been assembling for his planned retaliation. "We need to move on this now," Owen told them. "This military asshole thinks he can intimidate me, but he's got no idea who he's dealing with." What Owen didn't know was that Jerome was listening to every word, thanks to the surveillance devices he'd planted in Owen's truck during the power outage. Eddie Joyce, a convicted felon with arms like tree trunks and a face that looked like it had been carved from granite, laughed into the phone. "So what's the plan, boss? We grab the kid from the hospital?" "Not yet. First we send Daddy a message he won't forget. I want him to know what happens when someone tries to mess with Owen Shelton." Jerome listened to Owen outline his plan, a plan that involved targeting Jerome's mother, Dr. Paul, and anyone else who might testify against Owen if charges were ever filed. It was a systematic campaign of intimidation that would destroy innocent lives to protect Owen's freedom. Jerome had heard enough. That night, while Owen was sleeping fitfully in his power-restored house, checking locks and starting at every sound, Jerome was visiting Eddie Joyce. Eddie lived in a trailer park on the outskirts of town, in a double wide that he shared with rotating collections of girlfriends and drug dealers. Jerome studied the location for 2 hours before moving, identifying escape routes, potential witnesses, and security concerns. At 2 a.m., Jerome cut the phone lines and disabled Eddie's truck. At 2:15, he used a glass cutter to create a silent entry point in Eddie's bedroom window. At 2:30, Eddie Joyce woke up to find a man in black tactical gear sitting in a chair beside his bed, pointing a suppressed pistol at his face. "Eddie Joyce," Jerome said quietly. "We need to talk." Chapter 6, Psychological Warfare. Eddie Joyce had been in prison twice, had been shot at by rival drug dealers, and had once broken 3 ribs in a motorcycle accident without going to the hospital. But as he stared at the figure in tactical gear sitting beside his bed, he felt a fear unlike anything he'd ever experienced. The man's face was invisible behind night vision goggles and a black tactical mask, but his voice was calm, almost conversational. "Eddie, I understand Owen Shelton hired you to help intimidate some people. I'm here to offer you a counter-proposal." "I don't know what you're talking about," Eddie managed, though his voice was shaking. Jerome reached into his vest and pulled out a manila folder, dropping it on the bed beside Eddie. "Police reports from your last 3 arrests. Medical records from the hospital visits of your last 2 girlfriends. Financial records showing payments from Owen Shelton's company for consulting services that match up perfectly with times when people stopped pressing charges against him." Eddie opened the folder with trembling hands, seeing his entire criminal history laid out in perfect detail. I know about the woman in Wilmington who withdrew her rape complaint after you and Gary Grace paid her a visit, Jerome continued. I know about the union organizer who decided to stop pushing for better working conditions after Salvador Field broke his daughter's arm. I know about the city inspector who suddenly found Owen's work acceptable after you showed him photos of his son's school playground. You're a cop, Eddie said. Jerome laughed, and the sound made Eddie's blood freeze. I'm not a cop, Eddie. Cops have rules. They have procedures. They have oversight. I'm something much worse for someone like you. Jerome leaned forward slightly. I'm a father whose son is lying in an ICU bed because Owen Shelton thought he could terrorize a family without consequences. Eddie swallowed hard. What do you want? I want you to call Owen right now and tell him you can't work for him anymore. I want you to call Gary and Salvador and convince them to walk away too. And then I want you to disappear for a few weeks. And if I don't, Jerome stood up, and Eddie could see that he was taller than he'd initially appeared, broad-shouldered and moving with the fluid grace of someone who'd been in combat. Eddie, what do you know about psychological operations? About what? Psyops. The art of breaking someone's mind without laying a finger on them. Jerome moved to the window, glancing out at the trailer park. During my last deployment, we had a target, a bomb maker who was responsible for killing dozens of civilians. We couldn't touch him directly because he was protected by local tribal politics. So we had to get creative. Jerome turned back to Eddie. We started small. We moved things in his house when he wasn't there. We left messages that only he would understand. We made him feel like he was being watched every second of every day. Within 2 weeks, he was so paranoid that he couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, couldn't function. What happened to him? He made a mistake. Got sloppy because he was so terrified that he couldn't think straight. Walked into an ambush that he would have easily avoided if his mind had been clear. Jerome's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. Fear is a powerful weapon, Eddie, and I'm very good at using it. Eddie looked at the folder beside him, then back at the masked figure. You're talking about driving Owen crazy. I'm talking about showing Owen what it feels like to be helpless, what it feels like to be hunted, what it feels like to know that someone bigger and stronger than you is planning to hurt you, and there's nothing you can do to stop it. Jerome moved back to the chair, his movements deliberate and controlled. But here's the thing, Eddie. Owen hurt my son because he thought he was untouchable. He thought his money and his connections and his reputation for violence would protect him. You, Gary, and Salvador are part of that protection. So you want to take that away from him. I want to leave him completely alone with his conscience and his fear. No crew to hide behind. No reputation to protect him. Just Owen Shelton and the knowledge that the father of the boy he beat nearly to death is coming for him. Eddie was quiet for a long moment, processing what he was hearing. And if I help you, then you walk away clean. No charges, no retaliation, no problems. You find a new line of work, preferably one that doesn't involve hurting innocent people. And if I don't, Jerome reached into another pocket and pulled out a second folder, this one thicker than the first. Then you become part of my mission, Eddie, and I promise you that you don't want that to happen. Eddie opened the second folder and immediately wished he hadn't. Photographs of his trailer, taken from multiple angles. Photos of his truck, his girlfriend, the bar where he spent most evenings. Detailed maps of his daily routine. A complete dossier on every aspect of his life. But it was the last photograph that made Eddie's hands shake. A perfectly clear image of him asleep in the very bed where he was sitting now, taken through the window sometime in the previous week. How long have you been watching me? Long enough to know that you have 3 guns in this trailer, none of them registered. Long enough to know that you keep your drug stash in a hidden compartment under the kitchen floor. Long enough to know that your parole officer thinks you're working at a warehouse in Raleigh. Jerome stood up again. Make the call, Eddie. With shaking hands, Eddie reached for his phone and dialed Owen's number. When Owen answered, groggy and paranoid, Eddie delivered the message exactly as Jerome had instructed. Owen, it's Eddie. I can't work for you anymore. Whatever you're planning, count me out. What the hell are you talking about? We had a deal. Eddie looked at Jerome, who nodded encouragingly. Things have changed, Owen. You're on your own. After Eddie hung up, Jerome moved toward the window. Gary Grace lives in the Riverside Apartments. Salvador Field has a house on Elm Street. By morning, they'll have received similar visits. You're going to do this to all of them? Jerome paused at the window. Eddie, my son is 14 years old. He tried to protect his mother from a predator, and that predator beat him so badly that he almost died. Now that same predator is planning to hurt more innocent people because he thinks his reputation for violence will protect him. Jerome turned back to Eddie one final time. Owen Shelton is going to learn that there are some people you can't intimidate, some families you can't threaten, and some fathers you really don't want to make your enemy. And he's going to learn it alone. By morning, Gary Grace and Salvador Field had received similar visits and made similar phone calls. Owen Shelton's crew had evaporated overnight, leaving him exactly where Jerome wanted him, isolated, paranoid, and completely vulnerable. The real psychological warfare was just beginning. Chapter 7. The Trap Closes. Owen Shelton hadn't slept for more than 2 hours at a stretch in over a week. Every shadow looked like a threat. Every unexpected sound made him reach for weapons that he couldn't seem to access when he needed them. His gun cabinet remained mysteriously jammed. His spare pistol had vanished from his nightstand, and even the baseball bat he kept beside his bed had disappeared sometime during the night. The man terrorizing him was a ghost, striking without warning and vanishing without a trace. Owen had changed his locks twice, installed a security system, and even hired a private guard, only to wake up one morning to find the guard unconscious in his car and a new message taped to his bathroom mirror. Security can't protect you from guilt. But it was the discovery in his truck that finally broke Owen's resolve. He'd been driving to meet with his lawyer, hoping to find some legal remedy for what was happening to him, when he noticed the smell. Sweet, cloying, unmistakable. He pulled over and opened the glove compartment, finding a single white rose. Attached to the stem was a note written in careful block letters. Chris Long, age 14. Almost died because of you. Soon, you'll understand how he felt. Owen screamed in frustration and terror, hurling the rose out the window and stomping on it. But as he got back in the truck, he noticed something else. His radio was playing a song he'd never heard before, a haunting melody with lyrics that seemed to have been written specifically for him. When you hurt a child, you hurt the world. When you threaten a family, you threaten your soul. When you cross a father, you cross a line that can't be uncrossed. Owen fumbled for the radio controls, but they wouldn't respond. The song continued for exactly 60 seconds, then stopped, replaced by a voice he'd heard before, the calm, measured voice of the man who was hunting him. Owen, you've been alone for 8 days now. No crew to hide behind. No reputation to protect you. Just you and the knowledge of what you did to an innocent boy. How does it feel? Owen pounded on the radio, but Jerome's voice continued. You're probably wondering how I'm doing this. How I get into your house, your office, your truck, your most private spaces. The answer is simple, Owen. I'm better at this than you are. I've been hunting dangerous men in hostile territory for 15 years. You're just another target. The voice paused, and Owen could hear his own ragged breathing in the silence. But here's what makes you different from the terrorists I've hunted overseas, Owen. They fought for something they believed in, no matter how twisted. They had a cause, a purpose, a reason for what they did. You hurt a child because you enjoyed it. You terrorized a family because it made you feel powerful. You're not a soldier or a freedom fighter or even a criminal with principles. You're just a coward who gets off on hurting people smaller than you. Owen's hand was shaking so badly that he could barely hold the steering wheel. I know you're planning to run, Owen. I know you've been researching bus routes to Atlanta, looking into cheap motels, withdrawing cash from your accounts. But here's something you should understand. There's nowhere you can go that I won't find you. No hole you can crawl into that I can't reach. I have resources you can't imagine, skills you've never seen, and a motivation that will never fade. The radio crackled once, then went silent. Owen sat in his truck for 20 minutes, crying from exhaustion and fear, before finally driving to the police station. But when he tried to explain what was happening to him, the desk sergeant looked at him like he was suffering from a mental breakdown. Let me get this straight, the sergeant said. Someone is sneaking into your house and leaving messages, but there's no sign of forced entry. Someone is playing recordings in your truck, but there's no evidence of tampering with your radio. Someone is hacking your computer and following you around town, but we can't find any surveillance equipment. I'm not crazy, Owen shouted. This is really happening. Mr. Shelton, I've been a cop for 20 years. You know what this sounds like to me? It sounds like a guilty conscience. Maybe you should think about what you might have done to deserve this kind of attention. Owen stormed out of the police station, but not before noticing the framed photograph on the sergeant's desk. A young man in army fatigues standing beside a helicopter. The resemblance to Jerome Long was unmistakable. Jerome had allies everywhere. That night, Owen made a decision. He packed everything he could fit in his truck and prepared to leave Fayetteville forever. He'd go to Atlanta, maybe further. Change his name if he had to. Start over somewhere where the ghost hunting him couldn't reach. But as he carried his suitcases to the truck, he found Jerome Long sitting on his tailgate, no longer wearing tactical gear or a mask. Just a man in jeans and a flannel shirt, looking like any other father except for the eyes that had seen too much violence and the hands that knew too many ways to kill. "Hello, Owen," Jerome said quietly. "I thought it was time we met face to face." Owen dropped his suitcases and reached for his phone, but Jerome held up a small device that was blocking cellular signals in a 50-yard radius. No calling for help this time. No lawyers, no connections, no crew to hide behind. Just you and me in a conversation that's long overdue. Jerome slid off the tailgate and moved toward Owen with the same fluid grace that had characterized all of his nocturnal visits. "You know, Owen, I've spent the last 2 weeks studying you, watching you, learning everything there is to know about what kind of man you really are." Owen backed away, but Jerome continued approaching at the same measured pace. "You're a predator, Owen. You feed on fear and helplessness. You choose victims who can't fight back. Women, children, people who trust the system to protect them. You've built your entire life around being the biggest, strongest, most dangerous person in the room." Jerome stopped about 10 feet away from Owen, close enough to reach him in 2 quick steps, but far enough to give the illusion of safety. "But here's the thing about predators, Owen. In nature, they're only apex hunters until they meet something bigger, stronger, and more dangerous than they are. Then they become prey." Owen's voice cracked when he spoke. "What do you want?" Jerome smiled, and Owen finally understood why his victims had been so terrified. It wasn't the smile of a cruel man or an angry man. It was the smile of a man who had already decided how this was going to end. "I want you to understand what my son felt when you were beating him. I want you to experience the helplessness and terror that he experienced. And then I want you to disappear from this earth like you never existed." Chapter 8. Justice in the Shadows. Owen Shelton had always thought of himself as a dangerous man, but standing in his driveway facing Jerome Long, he finally understood the difference between a bully and a warrior. Jerome moved with the economy and precision of someone who'd been in real combat, who'd faced real predators and emerged victorious. "Please," Owen whispered, and the word came out broken and desperate. "I can pay you. Whatever you want. Money, property, anything." Jerome tilted his head slightly, studying Owen like a scientist examining a particularly interesting specimen. "You think this is about money? You think I flew back from a combat zone because I wanted your contractor profits? Then what? What do you want from me?" Jerome reached into his jacket and pulled out a photograph, the same one that had been on Lewis Thornton's desk, showing Chris at 10 years old, gap-toothed and grinning. "I want you to look at this picture, Owen. Really look at it." Owen's hand shook as he took the photograph. That boy trusted the world to protect him. He trusted adults to be honorable. He trusted the system to keep monsters like you away from innocent people. Jerome's voice remained calm, but Owen could hear the steel underneath. And when that system failed him, when he saw you hurting his mother, he did what any brave child would do. He tried to protect someone he loved. Owen stared at the photograph, seeing Chris's innocent smile, his bright eyes, his complete faith in a world that had betrayed him. For that act of courage, you beat him so severely that he almost died. You looked into the eyes of a child who was trying to be a hero, and you decided to destroy him. Jerome took the photograph back and carefully placed it in his jacket. That's when you made your fatal mistake, Owen. You hurt someone who belongs to me. Owen tried to run then, but Jerome had anticipated it. Owen made it exactly 3 steps before Jerome caught him. One hand gripping Owen's collar, the other positioned to snap his neck with a single twist. I'm not going to kill you here, Owen, Jerome said quietly, his mouth close to Owen's ear. That would be too quick, too clean. You're going to experience something much worse. Jerome released him and stepped back. You're going to disappear, Owen. Not die, disappear. Your business will collapse because your key employees will suddenly remember all the crimes they helped you commit. Your assets will be frozen because the IRS will receive anonymous tips about tax evasion. Your reputation will be destroyed because people will finally feel safe enough to tell the truth about what you've done to them. Owen fell to his knees, the weight of what Jerome was describing crushing him like a physical force. But that's just the beginning, Jerome continued. Because while your life is falling apart publicly, you'll be running from me privately. New city, new identity, new life, it won't matter. I'll find you. I'll be watching you. And just when you think you're safe, just when you think you can hurt someone else the way you hurt my son, I'll be there to remind you that some debts never get paid in full. Jerome knelt beside Owen, his voice dropping to a whisper. You see, Owen, I learned something during my years in special operations. The most effective way to deal with a predator isn't to kill them. It's to make them understand what it feels like to be prey. Forever. Owen looked up at Jerome, with tears streaming down his face. You can't do this. There are laws. The laws failed my son, Jerome interrupted. The system failed my family. So I'm implementing a new system, one where people like you don't get to hurt children and walk away free. Jerome stood and moved toward Owen's truck, removing a large duffel bag from the bed. This contains everything you'll need for your new life, Owen. Cash, new identity documents, a phone with one number programmed into it, mine. When you want this to end, when you're ready to face real justice, you'll call that number. And then what? Jerome's smile returned, cold and final. Then we'll see if you have the courage to face the consequences of your actions like a man, instead of hiding behind lawyers and intimidation. As Jerome walked away, disappearing into the shadows between houses, Owen Shelton understood that his old life was over. He was no longer a predator. He was prey, hunted by someone who would never stop, never forget, and never forgive. 3 hours later, Owen was driving south on I-95, using the cash and documents that Jerome had provided, beginning a new existence as a man with no past and no future. Behind him, Jerome Long was already implementing the next phase of his plan. By morning, Shelton Construction's key employees would be in FBI custody, arrested on charges of fraud and conspiracy. Owen's assets would be frozen, his contracts canceled, his reputation destroyed by a coordinated release of evidence that detailed years of corruption and violence. But more importantly, Chris Long would wake up to find his father sitting beside his hospital bed, and for the first time in 2 weeks, the boy would see something in his father's eyes that he recognized. Peace. Dad, Chris whispered, his voice still weak, but stronger than it had been. I'm here, son, and the man who hurt you is never going to hurt anyone again. Chris squeezed his father's hand with what little strength he had. What happened to him? Jerome looked at his son, this brave boy who'd risked his life to protect his mother, who'd faced a monster and refused to break, and made a decision about what kind of father he wanted to be. He learned that actions have consequences, Chris, and he learned that when you threaten a soldier's family, you start a war that you can't win. Chapter 9. Blood and Redemption. 6 months later, Chris Long stood in the backyard of his father's new house, the one Jerome had bought in a quiet neighborhood where no one would ever threaten his family again. The boy had grown 3 inches during his recovery, had filled out through the shoulders, and moved with a confidence that reminded Jerome of his own father. Ready for another round? Chris asked, holding up the boxing gloves that Jerome had given him as a welcome home present. Jerome smiled, wrapping his own hands with practiced efficiency. You sure you want to keep getting beat up by your old man? Maybe today's the day I take you down, Chris grinned, and Jerome felt a surge of pride at seeing his son's spirit completely restored. They'd been training together every day since Chris was released from the hospital. Boxing, martial arts, weapons handling, tactical awareness. Not because Jerome wanted his son to become a soldier, but because he wanted him to never again feel helpless in the face of violence. As they sparred, Jerome's phone buzzed with a text message. He glanced at it between combinations. Owen Shelton spotted in Phoenix. Still running. Still scared. Jerome had received similar messages every few weeks for the past 6 months. Lewis Thornton's network kept track of Owen's movements as he fled from city to city, always looking over his shoulder, always expecting Jerome to appear. The psychological warfare had worked perfectly. Owen was a broken man, living in constant fear, unable to settle anywhere long enough to establish the kind of power structure that had allowed him to hurt people in Fayetteville. "Dad, you're distracted," Chris observed, landing a clean jab to Jerome's ribs. "Sorry, son. Just thinking about work." Chris lowered his gloves and studied his father's face. At 15, he developed the kind of perceptive intelligence that comes from surviving real trauma. "It's about him, isn't it? The man who hurt me." Jerome had never lied to his son, and he wasn't going to start now. "It is. Is he dead?" "No." "Are you going to kill him?" Jerome removed his gloves and sat on the back steps, patting the space beside him. Chris joined him, and for a moment they just sat together in comfortable silence. "Chris, do you remember what I told you about justice versus revenge? Justice is about making things right. Revenge is about making yourself feel better." "That's right. When I first learned what Owen had done to you, I wanted revenge. I wanted to hurt him the way he'd hurt you. But as I planned his punishment, I realized something important." Jerome looked at his son, seeing the boy's intelligence and strength and fundamental goodness. Killing Owen would have been revenge. But making sure he never hurts another child, that's justice. So he's still out there, but he can't hurt anyone else. He's broken, Chris. Scared, alone, constantly running. He'll never again have the power to terrorize families the way he terrorized ours. And every day, for the rest of his life, he'll remember what happens when someone threatens a soldier's child. Chris was quiet for a moment, processing this. "Do you think Mom would have been proud of what you did?" Jerome's expression darkened slightly. They'd talked about Cheryl many times over the past 6 months, and Chris had slowly come to understand the truth about his parents' divorce. "Your mother made her choices, son. She chose to believe Owen's lies over my commitment to our family. She chose to expose you to a dangerous man because she thought he could give her something I couldn't. But she was scared too, wasn't she? You said Owen was hurting her." Jerome sighed, remembering Dr. Paul's words about the complexities of abusive relationships. "She was scared, yes. But she had options, Chris. She could have called me, could have gone to the police, could have protected you by leaving Owen and coming home. Instead, she stayed with a man who was clearly dangerous. And when you tried to protect her, she let him hurt you without facing consequences." Chris nodded slowly. "So you don't forgive her either?" "I don't forgive betrayal, son. Not from wives, not from business partners, not from friends, and not from family members who choose their own comfort over their children's safety." Jerome's voice was firm, but not angry. "That doesn't mean I hate your mother, but it means I'll never trust her again. And it means she'll never be welcome in our life." They were interrupted by the sound of a car pulling into the driveway. Jerome tensed automatically, his hand moving to the concealed pistol he always carried, but relaxed when he recognized Lewis Thornton's voice calling out a greeting. Lewis appeared in the backyard, carrying a file folder and wearing the kind of expression that Jerome recognized from their military days. "Jerome, we need to talk." "Chris, go inside and start your homework," Jerome said quietly. "But Dad..." "Now, son." After Chris had gone inside, Lewis sat down on the steps beside Jerome. "Owen Shelton is dead." Jerome felt something cold settle in his stomach. "Ow!" Phoenix police found him in a motel room 3 days ago. Single gunshot to the head. They're calling it suicide. Lewis handed Jerome the file, which contained police reports, crime scene photos, and a copy of the note that Owen had left behind. Jerome read it twice, his expression never changing. "I can't run anymore," the note read. "I can't sleep, can't eat, Can't think about anything except what I did to that boy and what his father is going to do to me when he catches up. I hurt an innocent child because I thought I was untouchable, and now I know what it feels like to be hunted. I'm sorry for what I did, but I'm too much of a coward to face the consequences. Maybe this is the only justice I deserve." Jerome closed the file and stared out at his backyard, where Chris's boxing gloves lay discarded on the grass. "You feel guilty," Lewis observed. "I do. Don't. You gave him exactly what he deserved, a chance to understand what his victims felt like. The fact that he couldn't handle it says everything about what kind of man he was." Jerome stood up and walked to the fence line, his back to Lewis. "I wanted him to suffer, Lewis. Not die, suffer. I wanted him to spend years looking over his shoulder, never feeling safe, never feeling powerful again. And he did suffer. For 6 months, he experienced exactly what you wanted him to experience. The fact that he chose to end it himself doesn't diminish what you accomplished." Jerome turned back to his friend. "What about Chris? What do I tell him?" "You tell him the truth. But the man who hurt him couldn't live with what he'd done. That justice doesn't always look the way we expect it to. And that sometimes the worst punishment for a predator is simply knowing that there are people in the world who won't let them hurt children." That night, Jerome sat on Chris's bed and told him about Owen's death. The boy listened without interruption, his face serious and thoughtful. "Do you think he suffered enough?" Chris asked when Jerome finished. "I think he got exactly what he deserved, son. Not what I planned for him, but what his own conscience decided he deserved." Chris was quiet for a long moment. "Dad, are you going to keep doing this? Hunting people who hurt families?" Jerome considered the question carefully. "Would you want me to?" "I want you to be my dad," Chris said simply. "I want us to be a family. But I also know that there are other kids out there who don't have someone like you to protect them." Jerome felt a surge of pride at his son's wisdom and compassion. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that maybe what happened to Owen should happen to other people like him. Maybe the system doesn't work because there aren't enough people willing to do what you did." Jerome kissed his son's forehead and turned off the light. "Get some sleep, Chris. We'll figure out the future together." As he walked to his own room, Jerome's phone buzzed with a new message from Lewis. "Got a case in Jacksonville. Father of 3 murdered by his ex-wife's boyfriend. Killer got off on a technicality. Family wants to hire us for security consulting." Jerome looked at the message for a long time, thinking about Owen Shelton's final moments, about Chris's recovery, about the kind of man he wanted his son to become. Then he typed back, "Send me the files. Some predators learned from example. Others needed more direct instruction." And Jerome Long had discovered that he was very good at teaching lessons that left lasting impressions. The war against those who hurt families was just beginning. This is where our story comes to an end. Share your thoughts in the comments section. Thanks for your precious time. If you enjoyed this story, then please make sure you subscribe to this channel. That would help me a lot. Click on the video you see on the screen, and I will see you there.